Okay, so we've put together a little bit of a summary. So you can see on the right-hand side there of some of the projects that Project 4 have been involved with and some of the timelines that might be being experienced for some of these projects. Now, the regulator is admittedly, and it admits itself, is struggling with resource in terms of both resource within the regulator and obtaining resource from those outside of the regulator, the building inspectors and the fire and rescue service to review the projects that are submitted for building control approval. So you will see that whilst the legislation frames a 12-week consideration and approval period, that's often being extended quite considerably. And I think the longest one that we're aware of right now is 37 weeks from submission to, well, not actually been approved yet, still there. So there are some significant problems in relation to building regulations approval for higher risk buildings. Now, the good thing is, of course, this is only relevant to higher risk buildings. And if they extend it beyond the current scope of what is termed a higher risk building, goodness only knows what might happen, but we'll watch that space with much anticipation. As you can see, I've got about 3 slides on these. You can see the varying number of weeks of submission. There's another one, Manchester Hospital down there, 18 to 26 weeks it's been there. The validation period for applications is getting much quicker. In the original phase, post-October last year, it was taking weeks and weeks and weeks for projects and applications to actually be validated. Now we're finding that it's happening within a matter of days. Now that's good. That's a good progress. Now we just need plans and submissions to be assessed properly. And of course, all of you good people here and all of industry has an important part to play in making the regulator's life easy in terms of providing the information that we think they want. And that's what we'll move on to discuss in a bit more detail. So there we are. We're getting a mixture of projects. Now, I think Project 4, that's just a summary. Project 4, I think, have got around about 30 or 40 projects now with the BSR, some of which have been approved, some not. Cliff.
What is validation then? What's that part of the process?
So that's essentially making sure that everything that should be provided, should be submitted, and I'll cover that in the next slide, has actually been deposited through the online portal with the regulator. So okay. If you say you need a building regulations compliance statement, is there a building regulations compliance statement?
I see. So it's validating the submission itself, but ready for somebody to then review it.
Absolutely. So before the technical appraisal begins, then it's validated as an application that should be there with the regulator.
Okay.
Clive?
Yeah, I was just interested to know, you say you've had some that have been approved. Mm-hmm. Have you had any new build projects approved yet, or are they under the umbrella of like a reclad type scheme?
Yeah, most of the ones that have been approved have been remediation projects. I think I've heard that 1 definitely, and maybe 2 new builds have been approved, but the majority of them have either been rejected or sent back for more information.
And are they ones that you've been involved in that have definitely been approved, or is that another consultant? Or
no, we haven't submitted any new builds in full scale just as yet. Okay. That we've got a lot in the pipeline, and we're working very hard to try and make sure that they're ready to go. I do some consultancy not only for Project 4, and you know, for big companies, Barclays, Dandara's with Project 4, but Barclay Group down in London for Totus Digital. And we're doing a few with Taylor Wimpey here and there. So there's a lot of stuff that's flying around. But everyone's being a little bit coy about submitting new build HRBs just yet.
Which is the big challenge, I guess, in the industry, is that nobody yet has got any experience under their belt having come out the other side of one.
No, and of course then the next biggest headache is going to be the during construction and the Gateway 3 challenge. But let's tackle Gateway 2 whilst we're here today. Let's leave it to that. We could be here for the rest of the week. So what I wanted to do just very briefly before we dive into a bit more on the Gateway 2 is just say, look, obviously there are significant changes to building regulations across the piece, both for high risk and non-high risk. So don't just think it's all high risk stuff. As I sort of mentioned around the duty holder roles, we have a new regulator. They do a lot of oversight of the building control work for high risk buildings, but they also have more broad duties to oversee the competence of all you people and the safety of the built environment as a whole. But the HRB high risk building work is obviously the only place you can go for building regulations approval for a high risk building. So that's the big challenge, is that has significantly changed. So we'll talk about all of those different documents in a moment. We'll go through them in a little bit of high level detail as to what they're supposed to do. And then that will help, I hope, influence you in terms of the information you're providing to your principal designers or to your clients in terms of those Gateway 2 submissions. So I'll just jump on to here, that sort of gives you a bit of a flavour. Obviously, higher risk buildings and non-higher risk buildings, the duty holder roles apply as across the piece. If you're doing building work, they will apply. For high risk buildings, you go to the regulator for your building control approval. For non-high risk buildings, you still have the choice of the local authority or a registered building control approver. And the biggest change, as you're all aware, is that Gateway 2 is that building control approval application that is a hard stop. You cannot start building work on that higher risk building until you have approval. There's the biggest challenge. So a few statistics from the regulator following a Freedom of Information request. They had, there we go, that was since October 2023. I think this was in the summer. This was requested. They'd had 1,000 applications, which is significantly more than they were anticipating. The majority of which are for existing buildings, the majority of which are relatively small and minor pieces of work, on the basis that suddenly everybody's realised that they'd been doing an awful lot of building work in existing higher risk buildings without building control approval. Who would have thought such a thing could have occurred? So some of these applications relate to simple projects such as putting in new fire doors, which is building work and does require approval from the building control body, and it doesn't get covered by a competent persons or third-party certification scheme, and yet they happen on a daily basis. So the regulator's being swamped with a whole load of other things. So you can see there are 147 out of the 1,000 that have been approved, but the lion's share of those are all works to existing buildings and relatively minor work. So what are we seeing? I suppose Gateway 2, the biggest challenge that the regulator has been providing feedback on is the fact that actually the information required by the legislation is not being provided at the application stage. So that's one of the big issues, and therefore there's there's a no-brainer, really, a no-brainer question. They're all written down in the legislation for you, and they're all listed, so you can go through and find out what applies and what doesn't apply. And then each project, really, through the principal designers and possibly the principal contractor, but certainly the client, should be driving that coordination piece to ensure those documents on that screen in particular are provided at the application stage. And what we do as Project 4 is almost, we do a little bit of a what's the right word, a peer review or a sanity check to make sure all of those elements are there before that submission. And I know P4 sometimes, oh dear, that slide doesn't look very good. Was it the deliverables? Sometimes Project 4 act as the sort of client agent and put the application in for the client, and it is the client that's submitting, not the designers or contractors. So we coordinate and make sure all of those relevant documents are in place. So before we get into the bit more detail, really what the law says, what the legislation says you must provide, you should have and be ready to provide as part of the application submission. So it shouldn't be that hard, but people are chancing it, is probably my phrase. And then I guess we go down to the next level, and that is okay, what sort of information is really required to allow the regulator to review? Now, I'll leave that up there for a moment. It's all relative to fire safety matters, that particular slide. What I would say is that the principle of Gateway 2 is for the designers to be able to demonstrate and explain how the functional requirements of building regulations are being met. So if you take that design, can you move it forward to build it, and it would be compliant with building regulations? Now, in my experience as a building inspector, that's my background, that's very rare that you'd have all of those aspects of what it takes and entails to construct a brand new high risk building in place at the moment you start digging foundations or laying drainage. And I think that's the biggest challenge. It's now forcing design teams to bring forward design information, design coordination, and getting a few basics ticked off the list. Now, I don't like the term sort of box ticking or checklists, but we all know what sort of elements are required to construct one of these complex products, one of these complex beings or buildings, if you like. They're all reliant on other trades, and everybody has to talk nicely to one another. And that's where the role of the principal designer really comes into play, coordinating all of the designers and ensuring that the designers that you need now to demonstrate compliance are brought on board to provide that evidence. And if that's a damp proofing detail or a fire stopping schedule or a piece of CFD analysis in the more complex world of fire engineering, or it's structural engineering calculations or whatever other methods it might be, or whatever pieces of information that might be required, this is the point where you start dragging those together. And the biggest challenge that we're seeing is, and it's slowly turning, the more informed and the more diligent are certainly dragging subcontractor design elements further forward in the program, which is a good thing to see. But it's not possible for everything, and there are some mechanisms to work around that. But what I try and do is here give you a bit of a flavour. So the numbers in the middle green column there are kind of linked to the RIBA stages of work. Effectively, we need stage 4 as a sort of benchmark really to submit a building regulations application. That's the challenge, is having that coordinated to that extent. If I go back to the plan of work and the HRB plan of work, we've tried to overlay a few things. I'll chat with Connor, who's put this together for me, and I'll make sure that we're all up to date. But we can circulate this later on. Make sure you get a copy of this presentation. But just think about the stages of RIBA, the plan of work, how that then feeds into gathering information and who you need when to start developing that information. Because part of the challenge is it's just often too late, isn't it? You're kind of not quite finished a few things, but you want to crack on and get underway on site. And that's the challenge and education for clients and funders and developers, is sometimes they're having to be told, no, it's not quite ready. We need to sort of share the message softly, make sure they're comfortable that actually there's no point putting something in that isn't complete as a design, because it's only going to get rejected and you'll be back at the back of the queue again. So take the principles of the plan of work, overlay the building regulations piece for higher risk buildings, make sure you've got all of these systems in place and you're dragging the relevant information, detailed information, to show how you comply with building regulations. So we talk about the building regulations. You'll find out all about competence and designers and principal designers and all their roles when you go to your meeting next week. But if I were to ask you whether you are all fully au fait with all the relevant requirements of building regulations, would you be able to say yes or no?
No.
Now, that's where the role of the principal designer comes in, and the collective design team, because actually you all know parts of the building regulations, you know the bits that are relevant to the work you do, and the interactions with other pieces of the building that you need to know and how they all link together. That's the role of the design team. Whenever I ask this question of anybody, nobody yet has told me that they don't comply with building regulations already. So that's good news. So nobody's asking you to do anything more than you would ordinarily have done. What the regulator is asking for is you to explain that. How have you done it? How are you going to build this? And with what materials, what products, what systems, what sections, what details, what specifications, and how do you meet all of these functional requirements of building regulations? So that's the big challenge. As I say, my experience as a building inspector is we often, we might get some structural calculations of maybe the foundations. We might get that. We certainly don't have a completed fire strategy. We won't have all of the external facade detailing. We won't have any damp proofing details at the time of the first piling going in. We might have some nice stage 3 report that tells me what you're all going to do, but we certainly don't have all the detailed design, and we're chasing it then for the entirety of the project. Let's bring it all forward at Gateway 2 to say, nope, you now need to tell us. That therein lies the biggest issue and biggest time drain for you all before you put in this Gateway 2 application. So let's go back to the principle of the compliance package, if you like, the information. And one of the critical parts of the expectation on the design team is for the design team as a whole, and certainly the application, to be able to explain to the regulator how the relevant functional requirements are being met. And if you can't, and I always look at it this way, if you can't explain to the regulator how you're complying with building regulations, or you haven't explained, how do you think they're going to approve it? So if you can't tell them, and you can't show your workings or point them to the right documents or explain in nice simple terms, this is how we're going to tank this basement, this is our pile design, and this is how we're going to install them, this is how we're going to test them, this is how we're going to provide you with the evidence of that testing once they're complete. What standards you're applying, are they the right standards? If you can't do that, then actually the regulator is perfectly within its rights to turn around and say, no, we're not going to give you an approval then. So just think of those principles. That's the critical part. So one step back from that is being able to understand the standards you're going to apply, the guidance that you might wish to use to support compliance with those functional requirements. Cliff.
When this process is going on, is the regulator obliged to say what's not there, or what the failure is on? Because my experience of submissions for building regulations has been that on occasion we can get a response that just says no, and then take a lot of time to find out what it is exactly that you've not quite got right. Is the regulator obliged to tell you what you've got wrong?
It is at the point of rejection. It isn't during that sort of, it's not as iterative or as a collaborative approach that you would have perhaps been used to with building inspectors in the past. Now, I kind of disagree with that to a certain degree. And when I was working at the regulator, we had a plan to allow that cursory review of a project to say, well, I think we've got everything we need here, we'll move on to a detailed design, or actually we're missing some fundamentals, let's go back, rather than reject straight away, let's go back and say, actually we're missing X, Y, and Z. Can we have that in this next period? Otherwise we'll have to reject. Now, that step isn't seemingly happening. So I think I would like to think that this system will develop slightly. The regulator is massively under pressure in terms of resource, as I mentioned, and therefore they're kind of taking a quite hardline approach. So yes, you'd like to think there was a collaborative, iterative process of please provide this information, but actually the power's in all of our hands to submit an application that by and large is pretty complete. Now, where you don't have that information, or you can't get it because of contractual arrangements maybe, or it's just too early, or there's something that you are relying on a subcontractor way down the line, you've got to have a really good reason why you can't get them in now to give you that information. Or you ask for a conditional approval on something specific that you say, look, this is really impractical to get now, but these are the principles. Take a sprinkler system, for example. You know what standard it's going to be constructed to, where the coverage is, where the water supply, what the sprinkler tank size is, where that's coming from, all the backup power supply, the pump sets. You can do all of that now, but what you won't have is the sort of pipework distribution layout from the specialist installer until 6 months before that might actually happen on site. So you can be careful and confident about the submission, but if you submit your Gateway 2 application and you don't have your reinforcement drawings for your floor slabs, you're very likely to get that as a straight rejection, because you kind of know that you should have that.
Okay. Has Clive got any experience associated with this part of the process?
Yeah, I was wondering when to jump in. I could just share a few. I've got one slide of challenges basically.
Okay, well let me stop sharing. We'll swap over.
Yeah,
Hang on.
I'll just give you a bit of an overview of challenges that we see whilst we are a waterproofing manufacturer, a designer, certainly not the capacity that the likes of Project 4 have in terms of the overall project review. We're currently working on about 30 projects that are going through Gateway 2. And what we found pretty interesting in that we're, as a company, trying to kind of embrace the change rather than push it off to one side and hope it isn't for real, which is a lot of what manufacturers are tending to do. We've seen it as a big shift in the industry, a massive change from how we've worked historically, because most of our element of design has always been the can of design has been kicked down the road until the ground worker is awarded, and then it's all hands to the pump to do a design within a sort of 3-week period, and more often than not, products start getting installed without any formal sign-off, and that has been the norm. Suddenly, this whole shift of design is changing massively, and what we're seeing is that the variation of, as Colin mentioned, about some people trying to get by with sort of bare minimum, others doing their very best to comply. There's such a variation from significant main contractors. So we are, I guess, in one sense, a small voice in the industry, just trying to do what we can to try and spread the word of how different people are approaching things and where we see success and where we see challenges, because it's a big journey that the industry's got to take basically on shifting their mentality, and it's not going to happen overnight. That there needs to be as many people as possible talking about it and talking about the right ways of doing things. But I will just cover off on a slide for 5 minutes on our challenges that we've so this is just some high level points I wanted to share. So we obviously covered off in terms of the excessive approval period, which everyone knows. There is the inevitable industry slowdown, which is what we've anticipated, and I think it's coming as a little bit of a surprise to a few subcontractors further down the supply chain. So it's important that from our perspective, everyone's doing their bit to kind of get up to speed, to try and bring the industry back up on its feet, and being more competent in how we're designing things. And the piece that we've already talked about, there's still no track history for principal contractors to work to on approvals that come out the other side yet. Hence, there's a lot of variation in people's expectations for design developments. But there's this part here about the master plan developments is an interesting one. I'd be interested if you've been involved in any conversations, Colin. There's a couple of schemes that we've been in conversations with main contractors on, which are like a sort of 10-year master plan development. They've got, let's say, 7 or 8 very large towers coming off a basement. they've got to design the basement in its entirety for the Gateway 2 application, but they're also being advised that they've got to have the design for every one of those towers complete. They've got to know what's they're going to be used for. However, the master plan design is that these towers aren't going to be built in their entirety for numbers of years. And they've got a real challenge in that they can't fully design towers that are going to be built in 3-4 years' time, because they're going to be determined by the landscape and the economy. It might be a commercial build, it might be a residential build. However, they can't get their Gateway 2 approval or even submit their application, is what they're telling us, because they're getting pushback from the building safety regulator because half of your development is not yet fully designed. And they're seeing it as a real challenge. But I don't know if that is and we've had it on a couple now, but I don't know if that's a common theme. I know building safety regulators can vary from one to another a little, but have you come across that previously, Colin?
Yeah, I think this is where there is a slight disconnect with the regulator's approach in some ways. I think that's requires a bit of an upfront discussion with the regulator before you start submitting an application, and to gain almost their approval in principle to the way in which you're going to submit that application, that type of application, so that you might have the full basement structure, or at least a phase of that basement structure sorted. And this occurred with Berkeley Group. They've got lots of these projects that sort of seem to last 10, 15, 20 years. And they build bits of basements, and they build some of it, and they build 3 tower blocks, and then they carry on and do another bit and build another couple. I think they've got to use the mechanisms within the legislation for staged applications, and also the use of conditions, so that they can almost say, right, this is my stage 1. I'm going to build these 3 blocks plus this part of the basement, and this is how it's going to work in isolation. And actually, our intent is to come on to blocks 7 to 9 over here. Right now, we believe that to be a residential block, and we will submit that full design at stage 2 or 3 in plenty of time before we get underway with that part of the work. So I think it's a combination of just discussing with the regulator first and foremost how to submit.
Because that was my understanding of staged submissions, is that is the reason they're there, is to enable these long time frame developments to be submitted partially. Anyway, that's interesting, because that's just confirmed what my thoughts was, and we're by no means a Building Safety Act consultant, but we get a lot of major sort of tier 1 ground workers approaching us, and they're sort of discussing challenges, and that was one that cropped up about 8 weeks ago.
The biggest challenge, sorry to cut across you there, but the biggest challenge there, Clive, is actually that each of those staged applications is a separate building regulations application in its own right. So if you imagine one going in now, 2024, the last one goes in 2030, the legislation applicable in 2030 will apply to that stage at that time. So it's really quite a challenge for these larger infrastructure and big schemes, but it's all written down that there are options.
Great, thanks.
That's interesting. And I think just the other couple of points there is there's still so much naivety in the industry, particularly with generally speaking, all of the main contractors are getting up to speed, and they are alert and awake to what's at hand, albeit they might have a different approach. But it's their subcontractors that are still very much in the woods as to what this really means for them. And we're trying to do our part in trying to educate them to understand what it really means, what these new processes look like, try and get them to kind of reposition their tender bids to look more compliant, and therefore look like a better supply chain partner for principal contractors and the like, because that is really, if I'm a main contractor, I want to partner with somebody who at least understands this language. We're all on a journey of learning, but if the supply chain is all very much at in an infancy state of knowledge, it's not doing anyone any favours. So That's a key challenge to overcome. And the last one there is another challenge where principal contractors do need to instruct and engage with various people on design, ourselves a typical one, early stage of works. However, more often than not, at that point in time, main contractor is in PCSA at best, and there's not any, and we can't expect, manufacturers can't expect any formal engagement. We're going to have to do some work to support projects to get them moving. And that is kind of the approach we're starting to take. We've been used to formal engagement on design. We're now having to take the approach where we're not going to be formally engaged, but we are going to do some work to support you to get the ball rolling, because design work is needed to be done a lot more ahead of time now. So that's another piece, but then there's reluctance from the main contractors in terms of commercial piece. They don't want to necessarily engage with somebody because there's challenges. So that's just a few things I wanted to share.
Thanks very much, Clive. I think Martin and Damien, who are our principal contractor representatives, no doubt recognise the commercial pressures that are being introduced to try and get subcontracts or PCAs in place when there is no formal main contract is a particularly challenging commercial aspect of this whole process. I don't know if you've got anything to say, Martin or Damien. No, clearly not. Okay.
I was only just going to jump in. Thanks, Colin and Clive, obviously, for what you've shared today. I find it really interesting and helpful. So I don't know about everybody else, but yeah, thanks for that. Crikey, there's so much we could spend hours talking about all of this. Obviously, it's a massive subject. I think just touching on that one piece, I think clients' funding is a big issue, and just all of the costs that are brought forward into pre-gateway 2 submission are clearly seem to be a challenge, and that is something that I think the industry will probably grow over the next 12 months to over the next 12 months and beyond to deal with, because that's the way that we tend to kind of react, find solutions and move forward. But I think we're in the middle at the moment. We are in that transition of just understanding. So clients, funders, contractors, supply chain, everybody's understanding of what's required seems to be slightly different, and I just think it's going to be a challenging period over the next 12 months. Certainly it seems to be that way. But I think the one thing that will I think put some, just certainly in terms of just touching upon what Colin was talking about previously with the information requirements and what does good look like in terms of a gateway 2 approach, I think once we've got, or the industry and stakeholders have got some sight of what good is, I don't think we should rely on that. And I think it's down to us to provide compliant designs, as it always has been, and build projects in a compliant way. But I think it just will put some just bring some sort of comfort if you can actually see what goods look like, and clients.
If one's actually approved, then you've got a good idea that you might go down that line.
There's a lot of I mean, that's what we're seeing. There's just a lot of, everybody's got an opinion, and ultimately you just want to see the people that are actually signing this off what they believe is good. So,
thanks, Damien.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Back to you then, Colin. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just conscious of time, and you're right, we could be here all day. I think if I put it back into context, this is all about trying to show how you comply with building regulations, which you're all doing anyway, so it shouldn't be that hard. It's just doing it at a slightly different time. I think funders and clients are starting to get the message that they can't build things as quickly as they might want to, so that changes their models and changes their assumptions, and they'll have to put some more upfront investment to get it over the line. That's just a fact. I don't think that the ship is going to turn. This is a cultural shift and cultural change for the next 20 to 30 years, and it's not going to happen overnight. So the more and more we can educate the industry as a whole, the better. The one thing I would say then is just to look forward slightly from Gateway 2. So let's assume you've got your happy path and you've got an approval and you then get to site. Part of the challenge for everybody in industry is now making sure that you then build what you said you were going to build, and install what you perhaps may have specified as you were going to install. And when you make changes, you have the mechanisms, the method in place to oversee change, to record it, to notify the regulator, and actually go back in for reapproval on those certain thresholds of pieces of information where you do need to do that. So there's a little bit of you've got to look forward now from Gateway 2. Great, you've got approval. Great, you've dragged a lot of design elements forward. But now the proof is in the pudding. Can you build? Will you build what you said you were going to? And when you get to the end, do you have the proof that you did that?
Yeah, we had Rui talk to us about the golden thread last time.
Excellent.
So we've got a good idea of that process, but I think it's true what you say. It's going to be quite a while before people have settled into the new norm,
Yes.
new normal.
The new normal. And I kind of use the HSE mantra. I'm pretty sure that the way in which they'll approach this is very much the way they approach HSW stuff. That if you've got a process, you're probably 50% of the way there if it's the right process. If you follow the process that you've actually put in place and you've got evidence that you've followed it, you're probably 90% of the way there to the answers. And then it's the little bits in the margins, the edge questions, the more debatable issues. But if you don't follow a process that you've written down and you've told the regulator you're going to follow, you're going to get some challenging questions. And if you don't have a process, then you're going to get some even more challenging questions, I should think. And I think just looking forward, that doesn't change anything that anybody in construction does already. You already have a QA process. You already have an ITP type process. You already have a flag when things aren't quite right and you raise issues relating to design or construction methodology. You've just got to overlay the competence of everybody you use to deliver that project and product, making sure that you hold them to account all the way through so that you can confidently tell the regulator at the end that you did comply with the regulations. And by the way, here's the evidence. Here it is. I've got it all here. Which bit would you like to see? Not, oh, let's hope they don't ask us about that. So that's kind of the approach, I think. So a lot said about construction industry not quite getting it or not stepping up, not making the changes they need to change just yet. I'm seeing that that's not the case. I think industry is grasping this and is getting hold of it properly. I think there's more to do. I think Dame Judith Hackett is very clear that the leadership of the industry needs to continue to grow and say, look, we're not going to tolerate things where they're not right and they're not safe. And I think that's my sort of final point, really, I suppose, and we certainly take some more questions, is, you wouldn't go forward and start putting a new car into production if you didn't know that the designs and the specifications were all ready to go and were sort of proven and they would comply with all the relevant standards and safety standards. You wouldn't do that. And I think if you apply that same logic to constructing a building, let's not do that either. And then you might be in a good place. Might be slightly more complicated, but actually cars are quite complicated, aren't they? They're all little things that rely on each other all the time. So I think overlaying all of that is that competence piece as well. And you'll go and talk to duty holders about principal designers and designers and all of those kind of things. But actually, all of you good people are competent for the jobs you do. If you've got more significant roles like principal designer, principal contractor, then you'll need to make sure those that are working under your control are competent as well, and make sure you provide them with the information to do their jobs properly.
Okay, thank you very much.